Chapter 22. Wind tore at her, but Celaena kept her focus on Nox, falling so fast, so far from her outstretched hands. People shouted below, and the light bouncing off the glass castle blinded her. But there he was, just a hand's breadth from her fingers, his grey eyes wide, his arms swinging as if he could turn them into wings. In a heartbeat, her arms were around his middle, and she slammed into him so hard that the breath was knocked from her chest. Together they plummeted like a stone, down, down, down toward the rising ground. Nox grabbed the rope, but even that wasn't enough to lighten the blinding impact on her torso as the rope went taut. She held on to him with every ounce of strength she had, willing her arms not to let him go. The rope sent them careening toward the wall. Celaena hardly had the sense to lean her head away from the approaching stones, and the impact burst through her side and shoulder. She held tight to him still, focusing on her arms, on her too shallow breathing. They hung there, flat against the wall, panting as they looked at the ground 30 feet below. The rope held. "Lillian," Nox said, gasping for breath. He pressed his face onto her hair. "Gods above." But cheers erupted from below and drowned out his words. Celaena's limbs trembled so violently that she had to focus on gripping Nox, and her stomach turned over and over and over. But they were still in the middle of the test, still expected to complete it, and Celaena looked up. All the champions had stopped to see her save the falling thief. All except one, who perched high, high above them. Celaena could only gape as the flag was ripped down, and Cain held his triumph. More cheers rose up to meet them as Cain waved the flag for every Anito see. She seethed. She would have won if she'd taken the easy route. She would have gotten there in half the time it took Cain. But Cale told her to stay in the middle anyway. And her path had been far more impressive and demonstrative of her skills. Cain just had to jump and swing amateur scaling. Besides, if she had won, if she'd gone the easy way, she wouldn't have saved Nox. She clenched her jaw. Could she get back up there in time? Perhaps Nox could take the rope, and she'd just scale the wall with her bare hands. There was nothing worse than second place. But even as she thought it, Varen, Grave, Pelayer, and Renaud climbed the last few feet to the spot, tapping it with a hand before descending. "Lillian." "Nox." "Hurry up," Brullo called, and she peered down at the weapons. "Master." Celaena scowled, and started sliding her feet along the cracks in the stone, looking for a foothold. Her skin, raw and bleeding in spots, stung as she found acre vice for her toes to squeeze into. Carefully, carefully, she pulled herself up. "I'm sorry," Nox breathed, his legs knocking into hers as he also sought out a foothold. "It's fine," she told him. Shaking, numb, Celaena climbed back up the wall, leaving Nox to figure out the way on his own. Foolish. It had been so foolish to save him. What had she been thinking? "Cheer up," Cale said, drinking from his glass of water. 18th place is fine. At least Nox placed behind you. Celaena said nothing and pushed her carrots around on her plate. It had taken 2 baths and an entire bar of soap to get the tar off her aching hands and feet, and Philippa had spent 30 minutes cleaning out and binding the wounds on each. And though Celaena had stopped shaking, she could still hear the shriek and thump of Ned Clement hitting the ground. They'd carried his body away before she finished the test. Only his death had saved Nox from elimination. Grave hadn't even been scolded. There had been no rules against playing dirty. "You're doing exactly like we planned," Cale went on. "Though I'd hardly consider your valiant rescue to be entirely discreet." She glared at him. "Well, I still lost." While Dorian had congratulated her for saving Nox, and while the thief had hugged and thanked her again and again, only Cale had frowned when the test was over. Apparently, daring rescues weren't part of a jewel thief's repertoire. Cale's brown eyes, shown golden in the midday Sunday, wasn't learning to lose. Gracefully part of your training? No, she said sourly. Arabin told me that second place was just a nice title. For the first loser. Arabin Hamel? Cale asked, setting down his glass. The king of the assassins? She looked toward the window, and the glittering expanse of rift-hold barely visible beyond it. It was strange to think that Arabin was in the same city that was so close to her now. You know he was my master, don't you? I'd forgotten, Cale said. Arabin would have flogged her for saving Nox, jeopardizing her own safety and place in this competition. He oversaw your training personally? He trained me himself, and then brought in tutors from all over Aurelia. The fighting masters from the rice fields of the southern continent, poison experts from the Bogdano jungle. Once he sent me to the silent assassins in the Red Desert. No price was too high for him. Or me, she added, fingering the fine thread on her bathrobe. He didn't bother to tell me until I was 14 that he was expected to pay him back for all of it. He trained you and then made you pay for it? She shrugged, but was unable to hide the flash of anger. Courtesans go through the same experience. They're taken in at a young age, and are bound taught air brothels until they can earn back every coin that went into their training, upkeep, and wardrobe. That's despicable, he spat, and she blinked at the anger in his voice. Anger that, for once, was not directed at her. Did you pay it back? A cold smile that didn't reach her eyes spread across her face. Oh, down to the last copper. And he then went out and spent all of it. Over 500,000 gold coins. Gone in 3 hours. Cale started from his seat. She shoved the memory down so deep that it stopped hurting. You still haven't apologized, she said, changing the subject before Cale could inquire further. Apologized? For what? For all the horrid things you said yesterday afternoon, when I was sparring with Nehemia. He narrowed his eyes, taking the bait. I won't apologize for speaking the truth. The truth? You treated me like I'm a crazed criminal. And you said that you hated me more than anyone alive. I meant every word of it. However, a smile began to tug at her lips and she soon found it reflected on his face. He tossed a piece of bread at her, which she caught in one hand and threw back at him. He caught it with ease. Idiot, she said, grinning now. Crazed criminal, he returned, grinning, too. I really do hate you. At least I didn't come in 18th place, he said. Celaena felt her nostrils flare, and it was all Cale could do to duck the apple she chucked at his head. It wasn't until later that Philippa brought the news. The champion who hadn't shown up for the test had been found dead in a servant's stairwell, brutally mauled and dismembered. The new murder cast a pall over the next 2 weeks, and the 2 tests they brought with them. Celaena passed the tests stealth and tracking without drawing much attention to herself or risking her neck to save anyone. No other champions were murdered, thankfully, but Celaena still found herself looking over her shoulder constantly, even though Cale seemed to consider the 2 murders to be just unfortunate incidents. Every day, she got better at running, going farther and faster, and managed to keep from killing Kane when he taunted her at training. The Crown Prince didn't bother to show his face in her rooms again, and she only saw him during the tests, when he usually just grinned and winked at her and made her feel ridiculously tingly and warm. But she had more important things to worry about. There were only 9 weeks left until the final duel, and some of the others, including Nox, were doing well enough that those 4 spots were starting to seem rather precious. Kane would definitely be there, But who would the other final 3 be? She'd always been so sure she'd make it. But, if she were honest with herself, Celaena wasn't so sure anymore. Chapter 23. Celaena gaped at the ground. She knew these sharp, gray rocks, knew how they crunched beneath her feet, how they smelled after the rain, how they could so easily cut into her skin when she was thrown down. The rocks stretched for miles, rising into jagged, fawn-like mountains that pierced the cloudy sky. In the frigid wind, she had little clothing to protect her from its stinging gusts. As she touched the dirty rags, her stomach rose in her throat. What had happened? She pivoted, shackles clanking, and took in the desolate waste that was Endevier. She had failed, and been sent back here. There was no chance of escape. She had tasted freedom, come so close to it, and now. Celaena screamed as excruciating pain shot down her back, barely heralded by the crack of the whip. She fell onto the ground, stone slicing into her raw knees. "Get on your feet," someone barked. Tears stung her eyes, and the whip creaked as it rose again. She would be killed this time. She would die from the pain of it. The whip fell, slicing into bone, reverberating through her body, making everything collapse and explode in agony, shifting her body into a graveyard, a dead. Celaena's eyes flew open. She panted. "Are you?" someone said beside her, and she jerked. Where was she? "It was a dream," said Cale. She stared at him, then looked around the room, running a hand through her hair. Rifthold. Rifthold, that's where she was. In the glass castle, no, in the stone castle beneath. She was sweating, and the sweat on her back felt uncomfortably like blood. She felt dizzy, nauseated, too small and too large all at once. Though her windows were shut, an odd draft from somewhere in her room kissed her face, smelling strangely of roses. "Celaena." "It was a dream," the captain of the guard said again. "You were screaming." He gave her a shaky smile. "I thought you were being murdered." Celaena reached around to touch her back, beneath her nightshirt. She could feel the 3 ridges and some smaller ones, but nothing. "I was being whipped." She shook her head to remove the memory from her mind. "What are you doing here? It's not even dawn." She crossed her arms, flushing slightly. "It's Samhain. I'm canceling our training today, but I wanted to see if you planned to attend the service." "Today's what?" "It's Samhain today? Why has no one mentioned it? Is there a feast tonight?" Could she have become so enmeshed in the competition that she'd lost track of time? He frowned. "Of course, but you're not invited." "Of course. And will you be summoning the dead to you this haunted night, or lighting a bonfire with your companions?" "I don't partake in such superstitious nonsense." "Be careful, my cynical friend," she warned, putting a hand in the air. "The gods and the dead are closest to the earth this day, they can hear every nasty comment you make." He rolled his eyes. "It's a silly holiday to celebrate the coming of winter. The bonfires just produce ash to cover the fields. As an offering to the gods to keep them safe. As a way to fertilize them." Celaena pushed back the covers. "So says you," she said as she stood. She adjusted her drenched nightgown. She reeked of sweat. He snorted, following after her as she walked. "I never took you for a superstitious person. How does that fit into your career?" She glared at him over her shoulder before she strode into the bathing chamber, Cale close behind. She paused on the threshold. "Are you going to join me?" she said, and Cale stiffened, realizing his error. He slammed the door in response. Celaena found him waiting in her dining room when she emerged, her hair dripping water onto the floor. "Don't you have your own breakfast? You still haven't given me an answer." "An answer to what?" She sat down across the table and spooned porridge into a bowl. All that was needed was a 3 heaps of sugar, and some hot cream and... "Are you going to temple?" "I'm allowed to go to temple, but not to the feast." She took a spoonful of the porridge. Religious observances shouldn't be denied to anyone. And the feast is a show of debauchery. "Ah, I see." She swallowed another bite. Oh, she loved porridge. But perhaps it needed another spoonful of sugar. "Well, are you going?" "We need to leave soon if you are." "No," she said through her food. "For someone so superstitious, you risk angering the gods by not attending." "I imagine that an assassin would take more interest in the Day of the Dead." She made a demented face as she continued eating. "I worship in my own way. Perhaps I'll make a sacrifice or two of my own." He rose, patting his sword. "Mind yourself while I'm gone." "Don't bother. Dressing too elaborately. Brolo told me that you're still training this afternoon. You've got a test tomorrow." "Again? Didn't we just have one 3 days ago?" she moaned. The last test had been javelin throwing on horseback, and a spot on her wrist was still tender. But he said nothing more, and her chambers turned silent. Though she tried to forget it, the sound of the whip still snapped in her ears. Grateful the service was finally over, Dorian Havillard strode by himself through the castle grounds. Religion neither convinced nor moved him, and after hours of sitting in a pew, muttering prayer after prayer, he was in desperate need of some fresh air and solitude. He sighed through his clenched teeth, rubbing a spot on his temple, and headed through the garden. He passed a cluster of ladies, each of whom curtsied and giggled behind their fans. Dorian gave them a terse nod as he strode by. His mother had used the ceremony as a chance to point out all the eligible ladies to him. He'd spent the entire service trying not to scream at the top of his lungs. Dorian turned around a hedge, almost crashing into a figure of blue-green velvet. It was the color of a mountain lake, that gem-like shade that didn't quite have a name. Not to mention the dress was about 100 years out of fashion. His gaze rose to her face, and he smiled. "Hello, Lady Lillian," he said, bowing, and then turned to her two companions. "Princess Nehemia. Captain Westfall." Dorian eyed the assassin's dress again. The folds of fabric like the flowing waters of a river were rather attractive. "You're looking festive." Celaena's brows lowered. "The Lady Lillian's servants were attending the service when she dressed," said Cale. "There was nothing else to wear. Of course, corsets required assistance to get in and out of, and the dresses were a labyrinth of secret clasps and ties." "My apologies, my Lord Prince," Celaena said. Her eyes were bright and angry, and a blush rose to her cheek. "I'm truly sorry my clothes don't suit your taste." "No, no," he said quickly, glancing at her feet. They were clad in red shoes. Red like the winter berries beginning to pop out on the bushes. "You look very nice. Just a bit out of place." "Centuries, actually." She gave him an exasperated look. He turned to Nehemia. "Forgive me," he said in his best Iowa, which wasn't very impressive at all. "How are you?" Her eyes shone with amusement at his shoddy Iowa, but she nodded in acknowledgement. "I am well, Your Highness," she answered in his language. Dorian's attention flicked to her two guards, who lurked in the shadows nearby waiting, watching. Dorian's blood thrummed in his veins. For weeks now, Duke Parrington had been pushing for a plan to bring more forces into Islay to crush the rebels so efficiently that they wouldn't dare challenge Adarlan's rule again. Just yesterday, the Duke presented a plan. They would deploy more legions, and keep Nehemia here to discourage any retaliation from the rebels. Not particularly inclined to add hostage-taking to his repertoire of abilities, Dorian had spent hours arguing against it. But while some of the council members had also voiced their disapproval, the majority seemed to think the Duke's strategy to be a sound one. Still, Dorian had convinced them to back off about it until his father returned. That would give him time to win over some of the Duke's supporters. Now, standing before her, Dorian quickly looked away from the princess. If he were anyone but the crown prince, he would warn her. But if Nehemia left before she was supposed to, the Duke would know who had told her, and inform his father. Things were bad enough between Dorian and the king. He didn't need to be branded as a rebel sympathizer. "Are you going to the feast tonight?" Dorian asked the princess, forcing himself to look at her and keep his features neutral. Nehemia looked to Celaena. "Are you attending?" Celaena gave her a smile that only meant trouble. "Unfortunately, I have other plans." "Isn't that right, Your Highness?" She didn't bother to hide the undercurrent of annoyance. Hale coughed, suddenly very interested in the berries in the hedges. Dorian was on his own. "Don't blame me," Dorian said smoothly. "You accepted an invitation to that party in Rifthold weeks ago." Her eyes flickered, but Dorian won't yield. He couldn't bring her to the feast. Not with so many watching, there would be too many questions. Not to mention too many people. Keeping track of her would be difficult. Nehemia frowned at Celaena. "So you're not going?" "No, but I'm sure you'll have a lovely time," Celaena said, then switched into Islay and said something else. Dorian's Islay was just competent enough that he understood the gist of it to be, "His Highness certainly knows how to keep women entertained." Nehemia laughed, and Dorian's face warmed. They made a formidable pair. Gods help them all. "Well, we're very important and very busy," Celaena said to him, linking elbows with the princess. Perhaps allowing them to be friends was a horrible, dangerous idea. "So, we must be off." "Good day to you, Your Highness." She curtsied, the red and blue gems in her belt sparkling in the sun. She looked over her shoulder, giving Dorian a sneer as she led the princess deeper into the garden. Dorian glared at Cale. "Thanks for your help." The captain clapped him on the shoulder. "You think that was bad? You should see them when they really get going." With that, he strode after the women. Dorian wanted to yell, to pull out his hair. He'd enjoyed seeing Celaena the other night, enjoyed it immensely. But for the past few weeks, he'd gotten caught up in council meetings and holding court, and hadn't been able to visit her. Were it not for the feast, he'd go to her again. He hadn't meant to annoy her with talk about the dress, though it was outdated, nor had he known she'd bet irritated about not being invited to the feast, but Dorian scowled and walked off to the kennels. Celaena smiled to herself, running a finger across a neatly trimmed hedge. She thought the dress was lovely. Festive indeed. "No, no, Your Highness," Cale was saying to Nehemia, slow enough that she could understand. "I'm not a soldier. I'm a guard." "There is no difference," the princess retorted, her accent thick and a bit unwieldy. Still, Cale understood enough to bristle, and Celaena could hardly contain her glee. She'd managed to see Nehemia a fair amount over the past 2 weeks. Mostly just for brief walks and dinners, where they discussed what it was like for Nehemia to grow up in Islay, what she thought of Rifthold, and who at court had managed to annoy the princess that day. Which, to Celaena's delight, was usually everyone. "I'm not trained to fight in battles," Cale replied through his teeth. You kill on the orders of your king. Your king. Nehemia might not be fully versed in their language, but she was smart enough to know the power of saying those two words. Your king, not hers. While Celaena could listen to Nehemia about the king of Adarlan for hours, they were in a garden other people might be listening. A shudder went through Celaena, and she interrupted before Nehemia could say more. I think it's useless arguing with her, Cale, Celaena said, nudging the captain of the guard with her elbow. Perhaps you shouldn't have given Turin your title. Can you reclaim it? It'd prevent a lot of confusion. How'd you remember my brother's name? She shrugged, not quite understanding the gleam in his eye. You told me. Why wouldn't I remember it? He looked handsome today. It was in the way his hair met his golden skin, in the tiny gaps between the strands, in the way it fell across his brow. I suppose you'll enjoy the feast without me there, that is, she said morosely. He snorted. Are you that upset about missing it? No, she said, sweeping her unbound hair over a shoulder. But well, it's a party, and everyone loves parties. Shall I bring you a trinket from the revelry? Only if it consists of a sizable portion of roast lamb. The air was bright and clear around them. The feast isn't that exciting, he offered. It's the same as any supper. I can assure you the lamb will be dry and tough. As my friend, you should either bring me along, or keep me company. Friend, he asked. She blushed. Well, scowling escort is a better description. Or reluctant acquaintance, if you prefer. To her surprise, he smiled. The princess grabbed Celaena's hand. You'll teach me, she said in Ioway. Teach me how to better speak your language and teach me how to write and read it better than I do now. So I don't have to suffer through those horribly boring old men they call tutors. Celaena began in the common tongue, and winced. She felt guilty for leaving Nehemia out of the conversation for so long, and having the princess be fluent in both languages would be great fun. But convincing Cale to let her see Nehemia was always a hassle, because he insisted on being there to keep watch. He'd never agree to sitting through lessons. I don't know how to properly teach you my language, Celaena lied. Nonsense, Nehemia said. You'll teach me. After, whatever it is you do. With this one. For an hour every day before supper. Nehemia raised her chin in a way that suggested saying no wasn't an option. Celaena swallowed, and did her best to look pleasant as she turned to Cale, who observed them with raised brows. She wishes me to tutor her every day before supper. I'm afraid that's not possible, he said. She translated. Nehemia gave him the withering glare that usually made people start sweating. Why not? She fell into Ioway. She's smarter than most of the people in this castle. Cale, thankfully, caught the general gist of it. I don't think that. Am I not Princess of Ioway? Nehemia interrupted in the common tongue. Your Highness, Cale began, but Celaena silenced him with a wave of her hand. They were approaching the clock tower, black and menacing, as always, but kneeling before it was Cain. His head bent, he focused on something on the ground. At the sound of their footsteps, Cain's head shot up. He grinned broadly and stood. His hands were covered in dirt, but before Celaena could better observe him, or his strange behavior, he nodded to Cale and stalked away behind the tower. Nasty brute, Celaena breathed, still staring in the direction in which he'd disappeared. Who is he? Nehemia asked in Ioway. A soldier in the king's army, Celaena said, though he now serves Duke Harrington. Nehemia looked after Cain, and her dark eyes narrowed. Something about him makes me want to beat in his face. Celaena laughed. I'm glad I'm not the only one. Hale said nothing as he began walking again. She and Nehemia took up behind him, and as they crossed the small patio in which the clock tower stood, Celaena looked at the spot where Cain had just been kneeling. He dug out the dirt packed into the hollows of the strange mark in the flagstone, making the mark clearer. What do you think this is? She asked the princess, pointing at the mark etched into the tile. And why had Cain been cleaning it? A word mark, the princess replied, giving it a name in Celaena's own language. Celaena's brows rose. It was just a triangle inside of a circle. Can you read these marks? She asked. A word mark, how strange. No, Nehemia said quickly. They're a part of an ancient religion that died long ago. What religion? Celaena asked. Look, there's another. She pointed at another mark a few feet away. It was a vertical line with an inverted peak stretching upward from its middle. You should leave it alone, Nehemia said sharply, and Celaena blinked. Such things were forgotten for a reason. What are you talking about? Asked Cale, and she explained the gist of their conversation. When she finished, he curled his lip, but said nothing. They continued on, and Celaena saw another mark. It was a strange shape, a small diamond with two inverted points protruding from either side. The top and bottom peaks of the diamond were elongated into a straight line, and it seemed to be symmetrically perfect. Had the king had them carved when he built the clock tower, or did they predate it? Nehemia was staring at her forehead, and Celaena asked, Is there dirt on my face? No, Nehemia said a bit distantly, her brows nodding as she studied Celaena's brow. The princess suddenly stared into Celaena's eyes with a ferocity that made the assassin recoil slightly. You know nothing about the word marks? The clock tower chimed. No, Celaena said. I don't know anything about them. You're hiding something, the princess said softly in Iowa, though it was not accusatory. You are much more than you seem, Lillian. I should hope I'm more than just some simpering courtier, she said, with as much bravado as she could muster. She grinned broadly, hoping Nehemia would stop looking so strange, and stop staring at her brow. Can you teach me how to speak Awi properly? If you can teach me more of your ridiculous language, said the princess, though some caution still lingered in her eyes. What had Nehemia seen that caused her to act that way? It's a deal, Celaena said with a weak smile. Just don't tell him. Captain Westfall leaves me alone in the mid-afternoon. The hour before supper is perfect. Then I shall come tomorrow at 5, Nehemia said. The princess smiled and began to walk once more, a spark appearing in her black eyes. Celaena could only follow after her. Chapter 24. Celaena lay on the bed, staring at a pool of moonlight on the floor. It filled in the dusty gaps between the stone tiles, and turned everything a bluish silver that made her feel as if she were frozen in an everlasting moment. She didn't fear the night, though she found little comfort in its dark hours. It was just the time when she slept, the time when she stalked and killed, the time when the stars emerged with glittering beauty and made her feel wonderfully small and insignificant. Celaena frowned. It was only midnight, and even though they had another test tomorrow, she couldn't sleep. Her eyes were too heavy to read, she wouldn't play the pianoforte for fear of another embarrassing encounter, and she most certainly wouldn't amuse herself with fantasies of what the feast was like. She was still wearing her emerald blue gown, too lazy to change. She traced the moonlight to where it lapped upon the tapestry-covered wall. The tapestry was odd, old, and not very carefully preserved. Images of forest animals amongst drooping trees dotted the large expanse. A woman, the only human in the tapestry, stood near the floor. She was life-size and remarkably beautiful. Though she had silver hair, her face was young, and her flowing white gown seemed to move in the moonlight. Celaena sat up in bed. Did the tapestry sway slightly? She glanced at the window. It was firmly shut. The tapestry was barely blowing outward, not to the side. Could it be? Her skin tingled, and she lit a candle before approaching the wall. The tapestry stopped moving. She reached to the end of the fabric and pulled it up. There was only stone. But Celaena pushed back the heavy folds of the work and tucked it behind a chest to keep it aloft. A vertical groove ran down the face of the wall, different from the rest. And then another one, not 3 feet from it. They emerged from the floor, and just above Celaena's head they met in a. It is a door. Celaena leaned her shoulder into the slab of stone. It gave a little, and her heart jumped. She pushed again, the candle flickering in her hand. The door groaned as it moved slightly. Grunting, she shoved, and finally it swung open. A dark passage loomed before her. A breeze blew into the black depths, pulling the strands of her hair past her face. A shiver ran down her spine. Why was the wind going inward? Especially when it had blown the tapestry out? She looked back at the bed, which was littered with books she wasn't going to read tonight. She took a step into the passage. The light of the candle revealed that it was made of stone and thickly coated in dust. She stepped back into her room. If she were to go exploring, she'd need proper provisions. It was a pity she didn't have a sword or a dagger. Celaena put her candle down. She also needed a torch or at least some extra candlesticks. While she might be used to darkness, she wasn't foolish enough to trust it. Moving through her room, trembling with excitement, Celaena gathered 2 balls of yarn from Philippa's sewing basket, along with 3 sticks of chalk and one of her makeshift knives. She tucked 3 extra candlesticks into the pockets off her cape, which she wrapped tightly around herself. Again, she stood before the dark passage. It was terribly dark, and seemed to be beckoning to her. The breeze blew into the passage again. Celaena pushed a chair into the doorway. It wouldn't do to have it slam shut on her and leave her trapped forever. She tied a string to the back of the chair, knotting it 5 times, and held the ball in her spare hand. If she got lost, this would lead her back. She carefully folded the tapestry over the door, just in case someone came in. Striding into the passage, she found it to be cold, but dry. Cobwebs hung everywhere, and there were no windows, only a very long stair that descended far beyond the light of her little candle. She tensed as she stepped down, waiting for a single sound that would send her springing back to her rooms. It was silent and dead and completely forgotten. Celaena held the candle aloft, her cape trailing behind her, leaving a clean wake on the dust-covered stairs. Minutes passed, and she scanned the walls for any engravings or markings, but saw none. Was this just a forgotten servant's passage? She found herself a bit disappointed. The bottom of the stairs soon appeared, and she came to a halt before 3 equally dark and imposing portals. Where was she? She had difficulty imagining that such a space could be forgotten in a castle filled with so many people, but the ground was covered with dust. Not even a hint of a footprint. Knowing how the story always went, Celaena lifted the candle to the arches above the portals, looking for any inscriptions regarding the sure death that would meet her if she walked beneath a specific arch. She took stock of the ball of yarn in her hand. Now it was little more than a lump of string. She set down her candle and tied another ball to the end of the string. perhaps she should have taken another. Well, at least she still had the chalk. She chose the door in the middle, if only because it was closer. On the other side, the staircase continued downward. In fact, it went so far down that she wondered if she were beneath the castle. The passage became very damp and very cold, and Celaena's candle sputtered in the moisture. There were many archways now, but Celaena chose to go straight, following the moisture that grew by the inch. Water trickled down the walls, and the stone became slick with whatever fungus had grown over the centuries. Her red velvet shoes felt flimsy and thin against the wetness of the chamber. She would have considered turning back were it not for the sound that arose. It was running water, slow-moving. In fact, as she walked, the passage became lighter. It was not the light of a candle, but rather the smooth, white light off the outdoors of the moon. Her yarn ran out, and she left it on the ground. There were no more turns to mark. She knew what this was. Rather, she didn't dare to hope that it was actually what she believed it to be. She hurried along, slipping twice, her heart pounding so loudly that she thought her ears would break. An archway appeared, and beyond it. Celaena stared at the sewer that ran past, flowing straight out of the castle. It smelled unpleasant, to say the least. She stood along the side, examining the open gate that led to a wide stream that undoubtedly emptied into the sea or the Avery. There were no guards, and no locks, save for the iron fence that hovered over the surface, raised just enough to allow trash to pass through. 4 little boats were tied to either bank, and there were several other doors. Some wooden, some iron, that led to this exit. It was probably an escape route for the king, though from the half-rotted condition of some of the boats, she wondered if he knew that it was here. She strode to the iron fence, putting her hand through one of the gaps. The night air was chilled but not freezing. Trees loomed just beyond the stream. She must be in the back of the castle, the side that faced the sea. Were there any guards posted outside? She found a stone on the ground, a bit of fallen ceiling, and hurled it into the water beyond the gate. There was no sound of shifting armor, no muttering or cursing. She studied the other side. There was a lever to raise the gate for the boats. Celaena set down her candle, removed her cloak, and emptied her pockets. Holding tightly with her hands, she placed one foot on the gate, then the other. It would be so easy to raise the gate. She felt reckless and wild. What was she doing in a palace? Why was she a Darlan's assassin? Participating in some absurd competition to prove that she was the best? She was the best. They were undoubtedly drunk now, all of them. She could take one of the less ancient boats and disappear into the night. Celaena began to climb back over. She needed her cloak. Oh, they were fools for thinking that they could tame her. Her foot slipped on a slick rung, and Celaena barely stifled her cry as she gripped the bars, cursing as her knee banged into the gate. Clinging to the gate, she closed her eyes. It was only water. She calmed her heart, letting her feet find their support again. The moon was almost blinding, so bright the stars were barely visible. She knew that she could easily escape, and that it would be foolish to do so. The king would find her, somehow. And Kale would be disgraced and relieved off his position. And Princess Nehemia would be left alone with Morana company, and, well. Celaena straightened, her chin rising. She would not run from them as a common criminal. She would face the king, and earn her freedom the honorable way. And why not take advantage of the free food and training for a while longer? Not to mention she'd need to stock up on provisions for her escape, and that could take weeks. Why rush any of it? Celaena returned to her starting side and picked up the cloak. She'd win. And after she won, if she ever wanted to escape her servitude to the king, well, now she had a way out. Still, Celaena had difficulty leaving the chamber. She was grateful for the silence of the passage as she walked upward, her legs burning from so many stairs. It was the right thing to do. Celaena soon found herself before the other two portals. What other disappointments would she find in them? She had lost interest. But the breeze stirred again, and it blew so hard toward the far right arch that Celaena took a step. The hair on her arms rose as she watched the flame of her candle bend forward, pointing to a darkness that seemed blacker than all the rest. Whispers lay beneath the breeze, speaking to her in forgotten languages. She shuddered and decided to go in the opposite direction to take the far left portal. Following whispers on Samhain could only lead to trouble. Despite the breeze, the passage was warm. With each step up the winding stairs, the whispers faded away. Up and up and up, her heavy breathing and shuffling steps the only sounds. There were no twisting passages once she reached the top, but rather one straight hall that seemed to lead on forever. She followed it, her feet already tired. After some time, she was surprised to hear music. Actually, it was the sound of great revelry, and there was golden light ahead. It streamed in through a door or a window. She rounded the corner and ascended a small set of steps that led into a significantly smaller hallway. In fact, the ceiling was so low that she had to duck as she waddled toward the light. It wasn't a door, nor a window, but rather a bronze grate. Celaena blinked at the light as she looked, from high above, at the feast in the great hall. Were these tunnels for spying? She frowned at what she saw. Over 100 people eating, singing, dancing. There was Cale, sitting beside some old men, talking and laughing. His happiness made her own face flush in response, and Celaena set down her candle. She peered at the other end of the massive hall. There were a few other grates just below the ceiling, though she could see no other squinting eyes beyond their ornate metalwork. Celaena shifted her gaze to the dancers. Among them were a few of the champions, dressed finely, but not finely enough to conceal their poor dancing. Nox, who had now become her sparring and training partner, danced as well, perhaps a bit more elegantly than the others, though she still pitied the ladies who danced with him. But the other champions were allowed to attend, and she wasn't? She gripped the grate, pressing her face against it to get a better look. Sure enough, there were more champions seated at the tables. Even the pimply-faced Peleer sat near Cale. A half-rate boy assassin. She bared her teeth. How dare she be denied an invitation to the feast? The tightness in her chest abated only slightly when she could find Kane's face among the revelers. At least they kept him locked up in a cage, too. She spotted the crown prince, dancing and laughing with some blonde idiot. She wanted to hate him for refusing to invite her. She was his champion, after all. But she had difficulty not staring at him. She had no desire to talk to him, but rather just to look at him, to see that unusual grace, and the kindness in his eyes that had made her tell him about Sam. While he might be a Haviliard, he was. Well, she still very much wanted to kiss him. Celaena scowled as the dance finished and the crown prince kissed the hand of the blonde woman. She turned away from the grate. Here the hallway ended. She glanced back at the feast, only to see Cale stand from the table and begin weaving his way out of the great hall. What if he came to her rooms and found her missing? Hadn't he promised to bring her something from the feast? Groaning at the thought of all the stairs she now had to climb, she picked up her candle and yarn and hurried toward the comfort of higher ceilings, rolling up the string as she went. Down and down she ran, taking the steps 2 by 2. She burst past the portals and darted up the stairs to her room, the small light growing with each bound. Hale would throw her in the dungeons if he found her in some secret passageway, especially if the passageway led out of the castle. She was sweating when she reached her chambers. She kicked the chair away, swung the stone door shut, pulled the tapestry over it, and flung herself on the bed. After hours of enjoying himself at the feast, Dorian entered Celaena's rooms, not sure what, exactly, he was doing in the chambers of an assassin at 2 in the morning. His head spun from the wine, and he was so tired from all the dancing that he was fairly certain that if he sat down, he'd fall asleep. Her chambers were silent and dark, and he cracked open her bedroom door to peer inside. Though she was asleep on the bed, she still wore that strange dress. Somehow, it seemed far more fitting now that she lay sprawled upon the red blanket. Her golden hair was spread around her, and a flush of pink bloomed on her cheeks. A book lay by her side, open and still waiting for her to turn the page. He remained in the doorway, fearful that she'd wake up if he took another step, some assassin. She hadn't even bothered to stir. But there was nothing of the assassin in her face. Not a trace of aggression or bloodlust lay across her features. He knew her somehow. And he knew she wouldn't harm him. It made little sense. When they talked, as sharp as her words usually were, he felt at ease, as if could say anything. And she must have felt the same, after she'd told him about Sam, whoever he'd been. So here he was, in the middle of the night. She flirted with him, but was it real? A footstep sounded, and he found Cale standing across the foyer. The captain stalked over to Dorian and grabbed him by the arm. Dorian knew better than to struggle as his friend dragged him through the foyer and stopped it in front of the door to the hall. "What are you doing here?" Cale hissed softly. "What are you doing here?" Dorian countered, trying to keep his voice quiet. It was the better question, too. If Cale spent so much time warning him about the dangers of associating with Celaena, what was he doing here in the middle of the night? By the word, Dorian. She's an assassin. Please tell me you haven't been here before. Dorian couldn't help his smirk. I don't even want an explanation. Just get out, you reckless idiot. Get out. Cale grabbed him by the collar of his jacket, and Dorian might have punched his friend had Cale not been so lightning fast. Before he knew it, he was roughly tossed into the hallway, and the door closed and locked behind him. Dorian, for some reason, didn't sleep well that night. Cale Westfall took a deep breath. What was he doing here? Had he any right to treat the Crown Prince of Adarlan in such a manner when he himself was going against reason? He didn't understand the rage that arose upon seeing Dorian standing in the doorway, didn't want to understand that sort of anger. It was jealousy, but something beyond it. Something that transformed his friend into someone else, someone he didn't know. He was fairly certain she was a virgin, but did Dorian know it? It probably made him more interested. He sighed and eased the door open, wincing as it creaked loudly. She was still in her clothes, and while she looked beautiful, that did nothing to mask the killing potential that lay beneath. It was present in her strong jaw, in the slope of her eyebrows, in the perfect stillness of her form. She was a honed blade made by the king of assassins for his own profit. She was a sleeping animal, a mountain cat, or a dragon, and her markings of power were everywhere. He shook his head and walked into the bedroom. At the sound of his step, she opened an eye. "It's not morning," she grumbled. And rolled over. "I brought you a present." He felt immensely foolish, and for a moment considered running from her rooms. "A present," she said more clearly, turning toward him and blinking. "It's nothing, they were giving them out at the party. Just give me your hand." It was a lie, sort of. They had given them to the women of the nobility as favors, and he'd snagged one from the basket as it was passed around. Most of the women would never wear them, they would be tossed aside or given to a favorite servant. Let me see it. She lazily extended an arm. He fished in his pockets and pulled out the gift. Here. He placed it in her palm. She examined it, smiling drowsily. A ring. She put it on. How pretty. It was simple, crafted of silver. Its only ornamentation lay in the fingernail-sized amethyst embedded in its center. The surface of the gem was smooth and round, and it gleamed up at the assassin like a purple eye. Thank you, she said, her eyelids drooping. You're wearing your gown, Celaena. His blush refused to fade. I'll change in a moment. He knew she wouldn't. I just need to rest. Then she was asleep, a hand upon her breast, the ring hovering over her heart. With a disgruntled sigh, the captain grabbed a blanket from the nearby sofa and tossed it over her. He was half tempted to remove the ring from her finger, but, well, there was something peaceful-looking about her. Rubbing his neck, his face still burning, he walked from her rooms, wondering how, exactly, he'd explain this to Dorian tomorrow. Chapter 25. Celaena dreamt. She was walking down the long, secret passage again. She didn't have a candle, nor did she have a string to lead her. She chose the portal in the right, for the other two were dank and unwelcoming, and this one seemed to be warm and pleasant. And the smell, it wasn't the smell of mildew, but of roses. The passage twisted and wound, and Celaena found herself descending a narrow set of stairs. For some reason she couldn't name, she avoided brushing against the stone. The staircase swooped down, winding on, and she followed the rose scent whenever another door or arch appeared. Just when she grew tired of so much walking, she reached the bottom of a set of stairs and stopped. She stood before an old wooden door. A bronze knocker in the form of a skull hung in its center. It seemed to be smiling. She waited for that terrible breeze, or to hear someone cry, or for it to become cold and damp. But it was still warm, and it still smelled lovely, and so Celaena, with a bit of mustered courage, turned the handle. Without a sound, the door swung open. She expected to find a dark, forgotten room, but this was something far different. A shaft of moonlight shot through a small hole in the ceiling, falling upon the face of a beautiful marble statue lying upon a stone slab. No, not a statue. A sarcophagus. It was a tomb. Trees were carved into the stone ceiling, and they stretched above the sleeping female figure. A second sarcophagus had been placed beside the woman, depicting a man. Why was the woman's face bathed in moonlight and the man's in darkness? He was handsome, his beard clipped and short, his brow broad and clear, and his nose straight and sturdy. He held a stone sword between his hands, its handle resting upon his chest. Her breath was sucked from her. A crown sat upon his head. The woman, too, wore a crown. It wasn't a tacky, enormous thing, but rather a slender peak with a blue gem embedded in the center, the only jewel in the statue. Her hair, long and wavy, spilled around her head and tumbled over the side of the lid, so lifelike that Celaena could have sworn it was real. The moonlight fell upon her face, and Celaena's hand trembled as she reached out and touched the smooth, youthful cheek. It was cold and hard, as a statue should be. "Which queen were you?" she said. Aloud, her voice reverberating through the still chamber. She ran a hand across the lips, then across the brow. Her eyes narrowed. A mark was faintly carved into the surface, practically invisible to the eye. She traced it with her finger, then traced it again. Deciding that the moonlight must be bleaching it, Celaena shielded the spot with her hand. A diamond, 2 arrows piercing its side, then a vertical line through its middle. It was the word mark she'd seen earlier. She stepped back from the sarcophagi, suddenly cold. This was a forbidden place. She tripped on something, and as she staggered, she noticed the floor. Her mouth fell open. It was covered in stars-raised carvings that mirrored the night sky. And the ceiling depicted the earth. Why were they reversed? She looked at the walls and put a hand to her heart. Countless word marks were etched into its surface. They were in swirls and whorls, in lines and squares. The small word marks made up larger ones, and the larger ones made up even larger ones, until it seemed the entire room meant something she couldn't possibly understand. Celaena looked at the stone coffins. There was something written at the feet of the queen. Celaena inched toward the female figure. There, in stone letters, it read, "A Time's Rift." It made little sense. They must be important rulers, and immensely old, but... She approached the head again. There was something calming and familiar about the queen's face, something that reminded Celaena of the rose smell. But there was still something off about her, something odd. Celaena almost cried aloud as she saw them, the pointed, arched ears. The ears of the Fae, the immortal. But no Fae had married into the Hvilliard line for 1,000 years, and there had been only one, and she was a half-breed at that. If this were true, if she was Fae or half-Fae, then she was. Celaena stumbled back from the woman and slammed into the wall. A coating of dust flew into the air around her. Then this man was Gavin, the first king of Adarlan. And this was Celaena, the first princess of Terrasen, Brannon's daughter, and Gavin's wife and queen. Celaena's heart pounded so violently that she felt sick. But she couldn't make her feet move. She shouldn't have entered the tomb. She shouldn't have strayed into the sacred places of the dead when she was so stained and tainted by her crimes. Something would come after her, and haunt and torture her for disturbing their peace. But why was their tomb so neglected? Why had no one been to honor the dead? This day? Why were there not flowers at her head? Why was Celaena Galathinius Hvilliard forgotten? Against the far wall of the chamber sat piles of jewels and weapons. A sword was prominently displayed before a suit of golden armor. She knew that sword. She stepped toward the treasure. It was the legendary sword of Gavin. The sword had wielded in the fierce wars that had almost ripped apart the continent, the sword that had slain the Dark Lord Erawan. Even after 1,000 years, it hadn't rusted. Though magic might have vanished, it seemed that the power that had forged the blade lived on. "Damaris," she whispered, naming the blade. "You know your history," said a light, female voice, and Celaena jumped, yelping as she tripped over a spear and fell into a gold-filled chest. The voice laughed. Celaena grappled for a dagger, a candlestick, anything. But then she saw the owner of the voice, and froze. She was beautiful beyond reckoning. Her silver hair flowed around her youthful face like a river of moonlight. Her eyes were a crystal, sparkling blue, and her skin was white as alabaster. And her ears were ever so slightly pointed. "Who are you?" the assassin breathed, knowing the answer, but wanting to hear it. "You know who I am," Celaena Hvilliard said. Her likeness had been perfectly rendered on the sarcophagus. Celaena didn't move from where she had fallen into the chest, despite her throbbing spine and legs. "Are you a ghost?" "Not quite," said Queen Celaena, helping Celaena rise from the chest. Her hand was cold, but solid. "I'm not alive, but my spirit doesn't haunt this place." She flicked her eyes toward the ceiling, and her face became grave. "I've risked much coming here tonight." Celaena, despite herself, took a step away. "Risked? I cannot stay here long, and neither can you," said the queen. "What sort of absurd dream was this?" They are distracted for now, but Celaena Haviliard looked at her husband's sarcophagus. Celaena's head ached. Was Gavin Haviliard distracting something above? Who needs distracting? The 8 guardians, you know of whom I speak. Celaena stared at her blankly, but then understood. The gargoyles on the clock tower? The queen nodded. They guard the portal between our worlds. We have managed to buy some time, and I was able to slip past. She grasped Celaena's arms. To her surprise, it hurt. You must listen to what I tell you. Nothing is a coincidence. Everything has a purpose. You were meant to come to his castle, just as you were meant to be an assassin, to learn the skills necessary for survival. The nausea returned. She hoped Celaena wouldn't speak of what her heart refused to remember, hoped that the queen wouldn't mention what she had spent so long forgetting. Something evil dwells in this castle, something wicked enough to make the stars quake. Its malice echoes into all worlds, the queen went on. You must stop it. Forget your friendships, forget your debts and oaths. Destroy it, before it is too late, before a portal is ripped open so wide that there can be no undoing it. Her head whipped around, as if she heard something. Oh, there is no time, she said, the whites of her eyes showing. You must win this competition and become the king's champion. You understand the people's plight. Irelia needs you as the king's champion. But what is? The queen reached into her pockets. They must not catch you here. If they do, all will be lost. Wear this. She pushed something cold and metallic into Celaena's hand. It will protect you from harm. She yanked Celaena to the door. You were led here tonight. But not by me. I was led here, too. Someone wants you to learn. Someone wants you to see. Her head snapped to this ideas. A growl rippled through the air. They are coming, she whispered. But I don't understand. I'm not who you think I am. Queen Celaena put her hands on Celaena's shoulders and kissed her forehead. Courage of the heart is very rare, she said with sudden calm. Let it guide you. A distinct howl shook the walls and made Celaena's blood icy. Go, said the queen, shoving Celaena into the hallway. Run. Needing no more encouragement, Celaena staggered up the stairs. She fled so fast that she had little idea of where she was going. There was a scream below, and snarling, and Celaena's stomach rose in her throat as she hurled herself upward. The light of her chambers appeared, and as it neared, she heard a faint voice cry from behind her, almost in sudden realization and anger. Celaena hurtled into the room, and saw only her bed before everything went dark. Celaena's eyes opened. She was breathing hard. And still wearing her gown, but she was safe in her room. Why was she so prone to strange, unpleasant dreams? And why was she out of breath? Find and destroy the evil lurking in the castle indeed. Celaena turned on her side, and would have gladly fallen asleep again were it not for the metal that cut into her palm. Please tell me this is Kale's ring. But she knew it wasn't. In her hand lay a coin-size gold amulet on a delicate chain. She fought against the urge to scream. Made of intricate bands of metal, within the round border of the amulet lay 2 overlapping circles, one on top of the other. In the space that they shared was a small blue gem that gave the center of the amulet the appearance of an eye. A line ran straight through the entire thing. It was beautiful, and strange, and Celaena faced the tapestry. The door was slightly ajar. She jumped from the bed, slamming into the wall so hard that her shoulder made an ugly cracking noise. Despite the pain, she rushed to the door and pulled it tightly shut. The last thing she needed was for whatever was down there to end up in her rooms. Or to have Celaena show up again. Panting, Celaena stepped back, surveying the tapestry. The woman's figure rose up from behind the wooden chest. With a jolt, she realized it was Elena. She stood just where the door was. A clever marker. Celaena threw more logs onto the fire, quickly changed into her nightgown, and slid into bed, clutching her makeshift knife. The amulet lay where she had left it. It will protect you. Celaena glanced at the door again. No screams, no howls, nothing to indicate what had just happened. Still, Celaena cursed herself for it, but hastily attached the chain around her neck. It was light and warm. Pulling the covers up to her chin, she squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for sleep to come, or for a clawed hand to snatch at her, to decapitate her. If it hadn't been a dream, if it hadn't just been some hallucination. Celaena clutched the necklace. Become the king's champion, she could do that. She was going to do that, anyway. But what were Elena's motives? Airily needed the king's champion to be someone who understood the suffering of the masses. That seemed simple enough. But why did Elena have to be the one to tell her that? And how did it tie to her first command, to find and destroy the evil lurking in the castle? Celaena took a steadying breath, nestling farther into her pillows. What a fool. She was for opening the secret door on Samhain. Had she somehow brought aloft this upon herself, then? She opened her eyes, watching the tapestry. Something evil dwells in this castle. Destroy it. Didn't she have enough to worry about right now? She was going to fulfill Elena's second command, but the first, that might lead her into trouble. It wasn't like she could go poking about the castle whenever and wherever she pleased, either. But if there was a threat like that, then not only her life was at risk. And while she'd be more than happy if some dark force somehow destroyed Kane, Parrington, the king, and Caltaine Rompier, if Nehemia, or even Cale and Dorian, were somehow harmed. Celaena took a shuddering breath. The least she could do was look in the tomb for some clues. Maybe she'd find out something regarding Elena's purpose. And if that didn't yield anything, well, at least she'd tried. The phantom breeze flowed through her room, smelling of roses. It was a long while before Celaena slipped into an uneasy sleep. Chapter 26. The doors to her bedroom banged open, and Celaena was on her feet in an instant, a candlestick in hand. But Cale took no notice of her as he stormed in, his jaw clenched. She groaned and slumped back onto her bed. "Don't you ever sleep," she grumbled, pulling the covers over herself. "Weren't you celebrating into the wee hours of the morning?" He put a hand on his sword as he ripped back the blankets and dragged her out of bed by the elbow. "Where were you last night?" She pushed away the fear that tightened her throat. There was no way he could know about the passages. She smiled at him. "Here, of course. Didn't you visit to give me this?" She yanked her elbow out of his grasp and waved her fingers in front of him, displaying the amethyst ring. "That was for a few minutes. What about the rest of the night?" She refused to step back as he studied her face, then her hands, then the rest of her. As he did so, she returned the favor. His black tunic was unbuttoned at the top, and slightly wrinkled, and his short hair needed a combing. Whatever this was, he was in a rush. "What's all the fuss about? Don't we have a test this morning?" She picked at her nails as she waited for an answer. "It's been cancelled. A champion was found dead this morning. Xavier the thief from Melisande." She flicked her eyes to him, then back to her nails. "And I suppose you think I did it?" "I'm hoping you didn't, as the body was half eaten." "Eaten?" She crinkled her nose. She sat cross-legged on the bed, propping herself on her hands. How gruesome. Perhaps Kane did it. He's beastly and Otto do such a thing. Her stomach felt tight. Another champion murdered. Did it have to do with whatever evil Celaena had mentioned? The Eye Eater and the other two champions' killings hadn't been just a fluke, or a drunken brawl, as the investigation had determined. No, this was a pattern. Hale sighed through his nose. I'm glad you find humor in a man's murder. She made herself grin at him. Kane is the most likely candidate. You're from Aniel. You should know more than anyone how they are in the White Fang Mountains. He ran a hand through his short hair. You should mind who you accuse.